World War I created a lot of problems. In the city of Sheffield, one of them was surprisingly simple. The army had taken most of the horses, but the factories still needed scrap metal hauled throughout the city. So one local businessman looked at the problem, considered his options, and hired an elephant. Her name was Lizzie. Now, before we get to Lizzie and her antics, we need to understand why the city of Sheffield needed an elephant in the first place. When most of us picture World War I, we picture the trenches, mud, barbed wire, shell craters, gas masks, and so on. What we don't always picture is the logistics, everything behind the wars and the trenches. An army does not simply arrive and begin to fight. It has to be fed, it has to be armed, it has to be hauled, it has to be supplied. Someone has to move the ammunition, drag the artillery, carry the timber, pull the ambulances, clear the roads, and deliver the mountain of material required to keep thousands of men alive long enough to continue to shoot at one another. And for much of that work, the armies of World War I still relied on animals, especially horses. This war may have introduced tanks, airplanes, poison gas, and machine guns capable of cutting down entire lines of men, but when something heavy needed to be moved, the answer was still often the same one humanity has used for centuries: put it behind a horse. Horses pulled guns and carried ammunition. They hauled food, medical supplies, and equipment. They pulled ambulances filled with wounded soldiers away from the fighting. Cavalry horses received most of the glory, probably because a man charging into battle on horseback looks considerably cooler in a painting than a tired animal dragging canned beef through 6 miles of mud. Most military horses were not galloping dramatically toward the enemy. They were working hard every day and in terrible conditions, and the demand for their work was ravenous. The British military bought and requisitioned horses from across the country and eventually the world. Farm horses, delivery horses, riding horses, but that created another problem. Those horses had jobs. They worked farms, they delivered goods, pulled coal, pulled wagons. They hauled the raw materials that kept British life and industry moving right along. So you could send the horses to war, but you could not send every job they had been doing along with them. And nowhere was that problem more important than the city of Sheffield. Sheffield was called the Steel City. They had been producing steel, weapons, tools, armor plating, and heavy industrial equipment for generations. Back as far as the 1860s, Sheffield industrialist John Brown had pioneered the production of armored plating and was apparently quite good at it. By the following decade, around 3/4 of Britain's ironclad warships were reportedly protected by armor plating made at Brown's company. So when Britain needed steel for the war, Sheffield was on duty and punching the clock. The city had been preparing for this particular nightmare for more than half a century, whether they knew it or not. And once the war began, that production became more important than ever, as Sheffield was producing guns, bayonets, naval shells, helmets, armor plating, and millions of other pieces of metal that Britain needed to stay in the fight. Production expanded, factories grew, more workers poured in, furnaces burned day and night, and the entire city became one enormous beating metal heart inside Britain's war machine. But steel doesn't magically arrive. It doesn't just show up next to the furnace. No, the raw material has to be brought in, and the finished material has to leave, and the scrap metal has to be collected, sorted, hauled, and fed into the process. And that meant carts, and carts meant horses, and as we've already established, they had been eminent domained by the government. So while generals in France worried about breaking the German lines, a scrap dealer in Sheffield faced a smaller but very real battle of his very own. The man's name was Thomas William Ward, and he had an issue. He had metal that needed moving, he had customers who needed it, he had a war economy demanding that that work continue, and he had very little to no horsepower left to do it. Now, Ward was not just a man wandering Sheffield with a cart and a hopeful expression. No, by the time World War I began, his company, Thomas W. Ward Limited, had grown into a major scrap metal and shipbreaking business. Ward made his living buying the things other people no longer wanted, dismantling them, and selling the useful material back into the industry. Old machinery, railway equipment, ships, industrial scrap. If it contained metal and had reached the end of its useful life, Thomas Ward was there. At the outbreak of the war, his company reportedly employed more than 1,200 people and supplied Britain's steelmakers with around 1,000 tons of scrap metal every single day. No, this was not a man with a little junk cart. This was an industrial operation. And an industrial operation moving that much material has to have reliable transportation. Now, a normal businessman might have looked for a motor truck, but early trucks were expensive. Mechanical reliability was often more of a suggestion than a guarantee, and most vehicles and fuel were requisitioned and used for the war effort. Now, the exact date and info gets a little fuzzy here. Some say Ward lost all of his horses, some say just a few, some say his deal to get Lizzie started in 1914, others 1916. Either way, it's more than a century later, so I think we can forgive some shoddy record keeping. Now, luckily for Sheffield, they did have this other option. Near the city's Wicker Arches, a traveling menagerie operated by William Sedgwick had taken up its winter quarters. A menagerie was essentially a traveling collection of animals displayed for public entertainment. Think circus animals, but with fewer safety regulations and considerably more Victorian flair. Among Sedgwick's animals was an Indian elephant named Lizzie. Lizzie had already been trained to perform and work around crowds. She was accustomed to people, she was strong, and she could follow commands, and most importantly, the Army had not yet developed a department for elephant requisitioning, so maybe her position was safe. So Ward arranged to lease her. It's difficult to know how that conversation unfolded. Perhaps Ward carefully explained the labor shortage and they were able to strike a deal. Maybe he just simply said, "How much?" Either way, Lizzie left the world of public entertainment and entered the scrap metal hauling business. And Lizzie was not brought in merely as a mascot or a publicity stunt, not like you might expect in today's world. No, she had a real job. She was fitted with a harness and put to work hauling carts loaded with scrap metal, machinery, and munitions throughout the city. Lizzie was a big, strong, powerful animal capable of doing the work of 3 or more horses. One account credits her with moving 28 tons of material in just 6 trips from a railway station to Ward's company, which means Lizzie was not merely filling in, she was crushing her performance review. Lizzie became a working symbol in the middle of one of Britain's busiest industrial cities. It was not a quiet country lane. It was smoke and steam and metal striking metal, factory whistles, machinery grinding away behind brick walls, furnaces burning hot enough to make the air feel heavy and depressive. And through the middle of all this comes this elephant pulling a scrap cart. There is even a surviving photograph of Lizzie at work with a load recorded at more than 8 tons. 8 tons, that's 16,000 pounds of metal being pulled through Sheffield by an animal who not long before had been part of a traveling circus. Lizzie was earning her keep, and because Sheffield's streets and industrial yards were covered with rough stone, sharp debris, and bits of metal, she reportedly wore special-made leather boots to protect her feet, which was both practical and probably the most adorable piece of industrial safety equipment in British history. Certainly glad to see somebody was looking out for the little lady. Imagine being that person, assigned to make those shoes. Most cobblers measure the foot, cut the leather, and send the customer on their happy way. This customer weighed several tons and could probably remove the roof and relocate the business if the fitting ran too long. There she was, clomping through Sheffield in custom footwear, pulling loads that would normally require a team of horses. And people noticed. Of course they noticed. How could you not? I mean, you could ignore a cart. You could ignore another tired horse or mule. You could probably ignore most things after spending 12, 14, or 16 hours next to a burning furnace. But an elephant walking past your shop or home window in leather boots tends to interrupt the day and leave an impression. Imagine going to work that morning. The war's dragging on, food is incredibly expensive, someone you love may be fighting in France, the newspapers are filled with casualty lists and grim promises that victory is just over the next horizon, and then an elephant strolls past hauling several tons of scrap metal. At that point, you have to stop and stare, or maybe even just giggle. And of course, she quickly became a familiar sight all around the city, and people gathered to watch her do her work. Children followed along, workers stopped what they were doing. She was a curiosity, certainly, but she was also doing something the people of Sheffield understood and respected. She was a working girl, and Sheffield was a working class town built around hard labor. People there knew what it meant to lift, haul, hammer, forge, melt, cut, and keep moving long after every part of the body was screaming to stop. They understood the value of anything that was capable of pulling its own weight, and Lizzie could certainly pull more than her fair share. She became more than an unusual replacement for the few missing horses. She became a local celebrity, a symbol of the strange improvisation required back on the home front, and proof that when war disrupts normal life, normal solutions can become a luxury. But at the end of the day, Lizzie was still an elephant. And elephants have trunks, long trunks, trunks capable of reaching through windows, which became incredibly important when food was in the vicinity. Now, according to the stories and the legends around her, Lizzie had a particular weakness for sweets and baked goods. And Sheffield's shopkeepers learned the hard way that an open window was not necessarily a secure border. One story claims she reached inside and helped herself to a freshly baked pie. Now, technically, stealing a pie is still stealing a pie, but if an elephant reaches through your window and takes it, I kind of feel like ownership has become more of a philosophical question than the letter of the law. And apparently pie was not the only thing Lizzie had opinions about. Another story says she ate a schoolboy's cap right off his head, which raises several possibilities and questions. Maybe she thought it was food. Maybe she just hated the hat. Maybe she finally reached her limit with early 20th century children's fashion. Who knows? Either way, the antics and the stories grew. I'd like to think we can all agree that it's pretty funny to think about some little kid having to convince his parents that an elephant had eaten his cap. A bit of a different take on the dog ate my homework routine. Now, how much of this actually happened as people remember it? Well, who knows? This is where Lizzie starts drifting from history into legend, and legends, as we know, tend to grow a little bit every time someone tells them. The pie turns into more pies, bigger pies, lots of pies. The hat situation becomes much more dramatic. The elephant gets stronger and more interesting. And after 100 years, facts and folklore are usually sitting right here at the bar arguing over who ordered what and sharing around. But that's part of the fun of stories like these, because whether every detail happened exactly as told or not, people remember Lizzie. And that is probably the best evidence of all that she was not just some odd little wartime footnote. She made an impression. Not bad for an elephant who was basically hired as a temp. Now, the stolen food and allegedly eaten headwear were not the only stories attached to Lizzie. One account claims she also knocked over a traction engine while playing with it. A traction engine was essentially a steam-powered tractor, a huge, heavy piece of machinery used to haul loads, power equipment, and perform the kind of jobs normally associated and assigned to several horses. In other words, not a toy. Lizzie apparently disagreed. The image of an elephant casually knocking over a steam engine does raise a few questions, the first being, how hard was she playing? And the second, who had to explain this to the boss or the insurance company? For that matter, were there insurance companies in World War I, and did they have an Act of Elephant clause in their paperwork? But Lizzie's relationship with heavy machinery also includes a redemption arc. Another story claims that when an engine became stuck in the snow, she helped to pull it free. So, according to local legend, she both knocked over and rescued traction engines. She created problems and she solved problems. That already makes her way more effective than a surprising number of wartime administrators. She gave Sheffield something strange and cheerful and wonderful to talk about during a period when cheerful subjects were hard to come by. The war was always there, in the factories, in the food shortages, in the casualty lists, and in the empty chairs in the homes. Then Lizzie and her walking boots come through town. She's funny, she's unusual, she's impossible to ignore. And for a few minutes, people could stop thinking about their loved ones dying in France and watch an elephant steal somebody's pie. History needs moments like that. Without them, the past becomes a wall of dates, casualty figures, political speeches, and serious men with impressive mustaches staring off into the distance in paintings. Stories like Lizzie's let us see ordinary life continues during the march of war. People still had to work, goods still had to be delivered, food still had to be baked, and children still had to head to school while protecting their hats from rogue elephants. But there is the other side to this story as well. The boots were not a costume. They protected her feet from the dangerous conditions. And that is the uncomfortable truth beneath this strange and charming story. Lizzie was still an animal pulled into a human catastrophe. And she was far from alone. World War I was fought by men, but it was carried by animals. Millions of horses, mules, donkeys, dogs, pigeons, camels, oxen, and other animals were pressed into service during this conflict. They hauled the artillery and the ammunition, pulled the ambulances, carried messages, searched for wounded men, and moved supplies through terrain where vehicles simply could not go. And they gave frightened and exhausted soldiers something warm and living to hold on to in a world that had become unrecognizable. To an army, they could be listed as transport, communication, or equipment, but they were living creatures. They felt exhaustion, hunger, pain, and fear. A horse doesn't know why the ground's exploding under its feet. A dog did not understand the national importance of the message tied to its collar. A pigeon had no opinion on alliances, empires, or the assassination of an Austrian archduke. They only knew what they had been trained, forced, and led to do. So they pulled, and they carried, they ran, they flew, and they endured. The scale of their suffering is difficult to comprehend. They died from artillery fire, gunshots, gas, disease, infected wounds, exhaustion, hunger, and exposure. The Western Front had been churned by artillery, rain, boots, wheels, and hooves. Roads disappeared, fields became swamps, shell craters filled with water and mud deep enough to swallow men, horses, wagons, and guns. And the animals, they still had to move through it. Many worked until they collapsed. When one fell, the war didn't stop or mourn. Another animal was simply harnessed, and the load moved on. That doesn't mean the soldiers didn't care. Many became deeply attached to the animals under their charge. They fed them, tended their wounds, slept beside them, talked to them, and many times risked their own lives trying to save them. For a soldier surrounded by death, a horse or dog could become something more than a piece of equipment. And when the guns stopped and the silence took over, many of the animals who hauled all that weaponry and equipment simply became surplus. Hundreds of thousands of animals were sold off, never to return home again. Many sold for meat. And Lizzie's story, sadly, is just as uncertain. Some accounts say she returned to the menagerie. Others say she stayed with Thomas Ward. And some say she worked on a farm. But more than a century later, the legend of Lizzie the elephant still lives on in Sheffield and around the world. And honestly, that's not a bad legacy. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Boots on the Hill, History from the Barstool. If you enjoyed the story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with somebody who might appreciate an elephant in work boots. Every subscription helps us keep digging up the strange, forgotten, and occasionally ridiculous corners of history that deserve another round. Until the next time, keep your boots on the ground, your drink off the map, and your pies safely at a trunk range.